Driving in video games has evolved to the point that driving games are trying to feel like real-world driving. The game started as a top-down driving game with no velocity or turning. It was just sliding up. It was faux driving, but it worked. Then AI was developed to race against them instead of a timer and just objects with no thought process. We started seeing actual, almost real engine-like properties. We even had gravity in-game to help with drifting. Even the most simplistic modern driving games have this. It comes to the point that driving is now a staple in most AAA titles. I mean, heck, even Halo, a game about shooting dumb idiot aliens on a ring, has a car. The jump in quality the creators went through to get to this point of a realistic driving game is impressive. I mean, I know we complain about the whole portion of E3 keynotes dedicated to cars, but it should be applauded to some extent. We went from a game called Space Racer to Mario Kart to Forza. It's wild how different driving looks in games. I even remember as a child playing some bizarro game machine that had a driving game of sorts. I can't even find the name of that game, or if it even exists. I thought it was on ColecoVision, but I'm not going to parse through that catalog of games right now. Video games gave me my first taste of what driving would probably feel like, even though it's not the same at all. I wasn't going to go out with my license and do Need for Speed type tricks at night. What's so unique is no matter how similar driving feels in games, they all interact differently. Each game has its own physics and hitboxes that interact differently from game to game. The issue, though, is that most driving games outside of maybe Mario Kart lack something. And that something is the charm of pure chaos of wild hitboxes, how your car interacts with those hitboxes, and deep gameplay mechanics. A game that does those things beautifully, and I know you know what game I'm talking about. Welcome to my review of Sega's 1999 arcade and later Dreamcast classic, Crazy Taxi.
Hey, come on over, have some fun with Crazy Taxi! Yeah!
The reason I chose Crazy Taxi as the next game to review in my series is very simple. Outside of obviously giving me a reason to play Crazy Taxi as exhaustedly as I had these past month, 2 months, maybe? So this past month and a half, whichever grammatically works the best. Obviously, that isn't the actual reason. The real reason being that Crazy Taxi, to me, is the perfect bridge to Tetris, a game that kinda, sorta, has an arcade version, and Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, a game that by all rights is an arcade game, but is purely on consoles. Also, I get to talk about an arcade game, because arcades are rad, and I don't mean, the arcades that are like the Dave & Buster's and Charles Entertainment Pizza, things like that. Things that where the games to get tickets are actual scams instead of, games based on some kind of skill or at least some kind of play on your part. Let's be real. People aren't lining up at an arcade or surrounding an arcade cabinet that's just watching some guy get a bunch of tickets in skee-ball. No, they're surrounding the arcade cabinet so they can watch the New York Knicks Sentinel. And even the Dave & Buster's and the arcades I'm talking about are really made to do one thing, which is eat money. That's the whole point, is to eat your money. And that's done in a couple of different ways. In the arcades like Dave & Buster's, like I said before, it's literally a scam and incentivizes you to pay more money to try to win the most amount of tickets. But in traditional arcade games, it's based off a timer, like Crazy Taxi, lives like in Metal Slug, or you just trying to beating your opponent in, against a versus mode in like a racing game or a fighting game. These are all things urging you to try to do better or to get farther, or in the latter's case, you just trying to beat your friend at goddamn Marvel vs. Capcom 2 because they're cheesing you out, man. The type of arcades I yearn for are now a dying breed, unfortunately, for a number of reasons. Reasons I cannot get into right now because this would add a whole chunk into this video. I might talk about it later, maybe, I guess, in another video. Really, what I needed to do was to talk about arcades in a way to frame both Tetris and Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 in the same light, and arcades do that because they, like I said, they're both arcade games. And that's why I've chosen Crazy Taxi as the perfect vehicle to do that. Eventually, I'll talk about Crazy Taxi. In my Tetris review, I mentioned that Tetris has an actual arcade cabinet. The big gameplay difference here being that each new board you start on has junk already pre-built into the board. I guess you could also say that like each level you progress, the game gets faster, but that's sort of natively built into Tetris as a whole and not just the arcade. So it's not specifically unique to the arcade version. Ignoring the actual arcade version of Tetris is actually an easy argument to make that Tetris is an arcade game. I'm sure you could walk up to someone who is vaguely familiar that video games exist and are aware of the concept of arcades and convince him that Tetris is purely an arcade game. Here, I'll give it a shot. Tetris is a video game in which you build a stack and subsequently destroy that stack while the game gets faster and requiring you to think on your feet with only one life. And you lose once the stack reaches the top. That's totally an arcade game, right? Like, that's classic arcade game. You got a life, and once you're done, that's it, game over. And this is despite the fact that Tetris is called a tile matching game, which is something I meant to bring up in my Tetris review, but completely forgot due to my needlessly bizarre writing style or writing process. So I'll mention it briefly here. Tetris is called a tile matching game. I don't know why. It's bizarrely wrong to me. It feels wrong to call it a tile matching game when really you're just placing pieces down and you're not matching anything. But I guess there isn't really an arcade genre. Like the arcade game isn't a genre of games really. But I guess also that's also an easy case to make that arcades games are a genre of games. There are some games that in order for you to progress more, you must pay money. Or if you run out of time, you pay more money. Or if you just want to play the game, you pay per play specifically. The games are usually short, so it's not really worth the $60 to shout for a regular console game. Bang, I did it. Figuring things out isn't that hard. This is all to say that Tetris does have an arcade version that was published by Sega, if you remember. But it's really more of a misnomer, seeing as the game isn't different or changed in any meaningful way that is different from its console home version that came out first. In contrast, Tony Hawk Pro Skater, the classic games up until before Thug, they all act very much so like arcade games. And once again, if you find a human being who knows that video games are a thing and that arcades are places to be, you could say and make the case that they're an arcade game. Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 is a game in which you have a certain amount of time to do as much as possible on a small map. That's an arcade game, baby. And if you found that same person before that knows that there are video games and that arcades exist, they'll be like, oh yeah, that's one of those, I guess. For obvious reasons, this is all I'll say about the Tony Hawk franchise currently because, you know, the next video in this series is the review of Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3, so I can't talk too much about Tony Hawk right now. In February of 1999, Sega would release into arcades Crazy Taxi, and just 2 months later, the magazine Game Machine would call it the second most successful arcade game of that year. It was only April. Isn't that insane? It's crazy that Crazy Taxi was that popular and that much of a smash hit with the youths in arcades that it was already being dubbed one of the top 5 games of that year. Obviously, we moved the goalposts just to get it into the arcade categories, but still, that's insanely impressive that 2 months after its release, it was just dubbed, yeah, this game fucking rips. Everyone loves it. But this is even more impressive that 20 years prior to them releasing Crazy Taxi, Sega didn't even make games. And here's something I was wholly unprepared to talk about in this exact moment of my life, but I went a little deep in my research, so I'm talking about it now. Crazy Taxi runs on Sega's Naomi system board. Arcade cabinets have system boards because that's how you how you get games to transmit the game on the cabinet, obviously. So if you don't have a system board, you don't have an arcade. I mean, if you open up your home consoles, you'll have a system board, even though it is probably more built closer to a modern day looking PC than like the large system boards that cabinets have, but you understand what I'm saying. Obviously, that's a little bit ways down the line in Sega's timeline, 20 years by my count. This is because, they didn't make games. They were purely just a distributor of arcade cabinets in Japan, given how insanely popular arcades are in Japan. They also distributed jukeboxes, but that's irrelevant to my point. But most of the cabinets Sega had gotten to distribute were secondhand and imported. So when it needed replacement parts or just to do routine maintenance, finding those parts would be a little difficult. So Sega was just like, why don't we just make the parts? And once they started making the parts, they're like, why don't we just make games? And they did. They were so successful. And unsurprisingly, to literally everybody, Sega's profit margin went up by $100 million United States dollars within a couple of years. And thus, Sega would make their mark on the video game world, being the most, or one of the most, prolific arcade game developers. All told, Sega would make 700 games, 50 franchises, and like 20 arcade boards? Yeah, I got that right in one go. Fuck yeah, I didn't even memorize my script. Obviously, that's just for arcade games. Console games are a whole other genre, specifically because of Yakuza and Sonic are not actually counted in the list of games I had, or, the 700 games and franchises I had mentioned before. And when the 90s rolled around, that's when Sega was really flourishing as an arcade game developer, especially with their boards. And their Naomi board was probably, not like a household name because that would be ludicrous, but it would be their most successful one given the games that it housed. It stands for New Arcade Operation Machine Idea. In Japanese, Naomi means beauty above all else, but I don't think that's specifically the reason they named it the Naomi board. That's because I know the reason why it's called Naomi is named after the model, Naomi Campbell. You know how she's a big video gamer. Now, obviously, the Naomi board is important because it housed Crazy Taxi, but it's also important because the Naomi board was the basis for the Sega Dreamcast. Now, obviously, due to hardware limitations, the Sega Dreamcast doesn't perform nearly as well as the Naomi board because it's not as beefy. The Naomi board crushes and outperforms the Sega Dreamcast across the board, but that makes sense given hardware limitations. Outside of Crazy Taxi, this board housed some of the most iconic games. It housed the sequel to Sega's smash hit arcade game, House of the Dead 2. It had 3D fighter that the US doesn't really super like, Dead or Alive 2. It had Monkey Ball, which would later become Super Monkey Ball, fan favorite Arena Fighter Power Stone 2, and last, but by certainly not least, because this is probably culturally the most important arcade game, Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was housed on this board. The Naomi board fucking ripped, my guy. I know we lamau about Sega and how they handle the Sonic franchise, but in the late 90s and early 2000s, they were heavily underappreciated. And that's why we as a society has failed them, and because of us failing them, they had in turn now failed us in the current, present, and not the past. The games they produced at the time were undeniably charming, especially as 3D was being more and more explored. And that is especially true on the Sega Dreamcast. Now, I'm at a crossroads here where I don't know if I'm going to talk about the Sega Dreamcast at length currently in this moment. I guess another time. Let's just say for now that Sega threw a Hail Mary to stay in the console game for as long as possible, and they did such a good job that they failed. So with the Dreamcast released, Sega had ported a lot of their most popular arcade games onto the Dreamcast, Crazy Taxi being one of them. Crazy Taxi did so well on the Dreamcast that other companies want a little bit of the action, so it was later ported to PS2, GameCube, and PC, with its subsequent sequels being released on the Xbox as well as the other consoles. Though critics would complain about these sequels, saying that the game never evolved. But that was the point. The creator of the franchise literally said the whole point of each Crazy Taxi game is to just play Crazy Taxi in a different part of the world. Idiot game critics didn't understand Sega's art. But granted, nobody did in the 2000s, or early 2000s, late 90s. Like I said, Crazy Taxi would be ported to the PC on 2002 and later added to the Steam store, which it would be gifted to me in July of 2012. I have recently bought a Sega Dreamcast with Crazy Taxi included, but have yet to play it in this portion of me writing this specific part of the script. At some point in the future of me writing this script, I will have played Crazy Taxi, and then I will probably seamlessly switch to me talking about Crazy Taxi on the Dreamcast. I don't know when that'll be, but it'll happen eventually. Like I said, needlessly bizarre writing process. Crazy Taxi on its surface appears to be like any other race against the clock type of arcade game, though it would buck the trend of X amount of money for Y amount of time. More on this later. The cabinet of the game looked like any other racing arcade game. Pedals, wheel, chair, things you need to drive. There would be a space-saving version of the arcade cabinet released later that would replace the seat with a bar as if you're playing DDR. And let me tell you, I've played this version of Crazy Taxi, and for me, personally, it's incredibly uncomfortable. The pedals are flush to the ground, so you are using the pedals in an unnatural way. It feels very weird to drive with a wheel while standing. This would also be frustrating to use the drive shaft if you know to use the drive shaft, which I didn't at the time. So I was really just playing an awkward version of Car DDR. Or Car Dance Dance Revolution, if you don't like acronyms. Really, that whole cabinet was a counter to how you were taught to drive. Obviously, standing while driving is bizarre in of itself, but to use your foot in a manner to press down on the pedals when you're at an angle, but now instead flat against the ground, is a bizarre feeling. Also, the drive shaft would be quite a reach away, and if you don't have a wingspan to effectively grab it, you wouldn't be able to effectively drive or play in Crazy Taxi well, which is weird considering the fact that the drive shaft only has two directions, drive and reverse, not any of the other ones in a traditional manual drive car or an automatic car with its own drive shaft. The drive shaft is essential to playing Crazy Taxi effectively, and if you're not educated on the matter, you're going to be playing pretty not great. And let me tell you, I was not educated until about a month ago, and the whole world opened up to me in Crazy Taxi. Here's the thing about Crazy Taxi. On its surface, it would appear to be a driving game with a single speed. Wheel to turn, pedals to brake and go forward. It would have a drive shaft, which would be kind of new, but that's assuming you weren't playing a racing game that didn't have a built-in manual drive, though. Some had that option, but really it was a mechanic you would use in the game and not something you would physically move. Crazy Taxi's just built different. The first trick would aptly be named the Crazy Dash, in which at a complete stop, you would throw the car into reverse, and then as close to the same time as possible, maybe a frame or two off, you would throw the car into drive and slam your foot, on the gas and floor it. And if everything would go right, your car would hitch and you would boost really fast. Now, the other trick is the limiter cut, which is said to only be able to be done while after doing the crazy dash, which is a false statement. You can do it. It doesn't matter. You can do it whenever you want while moving. And instead of being at a complete stop, you just let off the gas, throw the car into reverse, throw that baby back into drive, and floor it. And you would hopefully get a little boost in speed. There are some that are better than others. Some will really give you a nice boost in speed, though you can't really turn as sharply. And some would just give you a nice little boost that would be noticeable.
Let's move it. Shut up and move your butt. Yeah.
Being able to do these tricks consistently is crucial to having a good run in Crazy Taxi. And on the PC version, I'm terrible at doing them. Let me tell you, I maybe get the Crazy Dash 1 every 10 tries, and that's being incredibly generous. The limiter cut, on the other hand, I would get fairly often, though you could just spam it. You can do it as often as you want to get the speed, because attempting to do the trick and failing wouldn't actually slow you down in any meaningful way. There is another trick in Crazy Taxi, though in my opinion it is not as valuable as the other two I had just mentioned, and it's called the Crazy Drift. Now, drifting isn't wholly unique in Crazy Taxi. It can be found in any driving game, and traditionally drifting would work like this. You maybe let off the gas depending on the game's input mechanics. You would then tap the brakes, turn in the direction you want to go, and then hit the gas, and you would seemingly drift and then power into the turn you would want to go through. While drifting in modern games, or any game really, you have a decent amount of control over your car. In Crazy Taxi, it's a little bit different, and there are actually 3 different ways to drift in Crazy Taxi, all each giving you a different degree of control, and they're all done in just different enough ways that you really have to pay attention to which way you're doing it. I guess I'll talk about the Granny's Crazy Drift, which is kind of the more popular of the 3 options. I'll discuss how to drift in Crazy Taxi for the sake of being thorough, and I'll talk about why I don't think it's a good idea to do. To drift in Crazy Taxi, right before you want to turn, you veer into the opposite direction, throw the car into reverse, throw the car into drive, and you would brake and turn. And this would give you a drift of sorts, and then once you would hit the gas, you would go into the direction in which you are currently facing, which means you have no means of correcting yourself from fishtailing. You have to be as precise as possible, which isn't a great thing when speed and precision is more important than drifting, because you want to be going as fast as possible. And often, no matter what kind of drift you do, you might hit a wall and lose your speed. You might just lose your speed from naturally drifting, or you might lose the combo you've built up while driving. The good thing about the Granny's Crazy Drift is that it would start your combo sooner, but you might lose it just as fast. The combo is important for getting a little extra dosh from your passenger as like a tip. Really, it's an ineffective way, given that the likelihood of you losing your combo and going back from 0 is very likely. Realistically, for me, the only good time to drift is once you've reached your passenger's location and you can drift into the wall of the location to stop faster and also earn a little extra money. But outside of that, it's not really good to do at all. I mentioned your passenger, so I'll talk about how the game works. Step 1, you pick up a passenger. Step 2, you go to their destination. Step 3, repeat until you lose. Now, passengers are denoted from colors that represent the distance for driving. Green being the longest distance you'll have to drive, going gradually in a gradient to red, which will be the shortest distance. It should be noted that outside of the game's timer in the upper left, these passengers also have their own separate timers, and if you don't get them to their destination once their timer runs out, they'll call you a loser and leave. Their timers and their levels of difficulty is actually relevant for two reasons. The first being the longer the trip, the bigger the starting fare of money you'll earn from that person. And obviously this will go up based on you doing a number of things and increase a combo to earn more on top of that, as a sort of reward system for doing better and getting your combo larger. The ways to do this are narrowly missing cars, doing jumps, and as I mentioned before, drifting. Like I said, drifting might make you lose your combo. So really what you really want to be focused on is narrow misses of other cars and doing jumps only when convenient for you, for shortcuts and things like that. The second reason is that picking up someone closer to green or green would give you the longest amount of time to drop that person off, thereby making the margin of error larger. You can make more mistakes and still get them to where they need to go. One of the things I had mentioned was that Crazy Taxi bucked the trend of X amount of money for Y amount of time. Because when you pick up a customer, you'll earn a percentage of their total time to your overall time. Now, this can be skewed in the settings of Crazy Taxi, and I'm sure in the back end of the arcade versions, it could be done the same way. So realistically, you could play as long as your skill or luck would allow. And which is why longer trips would be more important, because it would also add more time back and giving you longer chance at playing. And if you know where that passenger is going already, you can format a path that you'd want to take. And the map is very open for you doing that. Think of the map as one big circle or oblong with a lot of intersecting paths into it. It really is just a big circle when you think about it. You could drive in a circle on the map, pretty sure. There are shortcuts built into the map, and the landmarks and locations that your passengers want to go are very recognizable if you remember the map layout well, so you could remember how to get them to where they need to go. Some of the points of interest are actually branded stores, though in the Steam release, since the license had fallen through, you get like store brand names of places. So the Pizza Hut becomes the Pizza Parlor. The Kentucky Fried Chicken becomes the Fried Chicken Shack. The Tower Records, rest in peace, becomes the record store. And the original Levi's store becomes the clothing store. It's very funny to me that they have to call it the original Levi's store. The maps are also inspired by American cities, mainly West Coast, and more specifically, San Francisco. And like I said, the game has charm, and that includes the maps. The branded stores in its own right actually adds to the charm of the game because it makes it feel real. Though it is funny that there's Take Me to the Fila store, which is, there were Fila stores? I thought those were just a clothing company that would just put them in department stores. I guess that'd be me getting in a cab and saying, "Take me to the Uniqlo, please." The maps are a lot of fun to navigate through. There are some trap locations that would lead you to a dead end, or some that would be in the congested downtown area. Probably most important things to know about the passengers that their locations are somewhat fixed. I think, as far as I can tell, each customer has 2 locations, and it's based on a cycle of how many passengers you had dropped off in that time. And also, obviously, how the map is loaded in. Since there are 2 locations, that means there are 2 colors associated to them. So if you know the 2 locations, you could gauge whether or not you would want to take them if it's to a more favorable location, or, the longer trip if that were an option. On the original map, on the PC and Dreamcast version of the game, that is what I did. I picked up the same person each time because your first 3 choices never changed. I would drop them off at where they want to go, and then I would assess who's around. I would typically go to Pizza Hut next, given who was around. Usually that would be the second location, and hopefully my third would be the Marine Park, I think is what it's called, and that would net me a lot of time and a lot of money for not a lot of work, because I've memorized the map. I know where to go. You can't really make a true optimal path because who knows what the timers are really based on without really digging through the code of the game. So you would have to improvise, sometimes spending a couple of seconds just driving to find a yellow to green boy to pick up for some fare instead of getting the closest person possible. That would only give you a little bit of time and you might just be stuck in the same area with not a lot of options. Once you have run out of time and your shift is over as a taxi driver, you will be given a grade based on the amount of money you had earned, starting at E, which is literally turning on the game and then walking away, to S, which is the classic arcade score, and which would be, I think it's like 5,000, 6,000 more for an S license, and then all the way up 2 levels more to crazy license, which is $20,000 earned in one shift. A score I worked tirelessly to get on PC to no avail. I was terrible on PC. I barely got S license on PC, and that's with the game being set to as easy settings as possible. Though once I played on my Dreamcast, my true ability was unlocked. I was hilariously better on Dreamcast than I was on PC, which is funny to say that I'm better on console than I am on PC. On my first play on Dreamcast, I beat my PC high score by $8,000. And I had actually set it a little bit more difficult than when I had played on PC. I was able to get the crazy license 3 times in a day. Obviously, I was recording to get the footage of it. The first time it corrupted, so I had to do it again. It corrupted again, so I had to do it a 3rd time. In the span of like 5 hours, I did it. Still, the satisfaction when I got it each time ruled because I was still beating those scores. I was beating the last score I had gotten each time, which was very good to feel. I was trying to figure out why this was the case, why I was actually better on console than I was on PC, which is, like I said, weird to say because I'm a true PC gamer. That's really what I play on. I was trying to think of the reasons why I would be better on console than PC. And then it occurred to me, the frame rate on PC is probably at a flat 60, which is what the highest frame rate would be on the Dreamcast. And on top of that, it would be at the consistent 60, whereas on Dreamcast, you would probably be getting dips in frame rate when it was trying to render a lot more. This is given to the limited technology of the Dreamcast and also the fact that most computers could probably run Crazy Taxi at a flat 60 through the whole game. So I popped on Crazy Taxi while writing this specific part of the script, something that was not originally in my script, and saw and confirmed that yes, it was always running at 60 frames. But funnily enough, I beat my record on Dreamcast during that specific run on PC, which is hilariously ironic for me. This is probably due to high map familiarity than I ever had with, Dreamcast or my early runs of PC up until that point. I never did a crazy dash in the run. I would do the limiter cut because it was easy to do. I was just playing for better than I was normally being able to play. The frame rate thing does hold water to an extent. I wasn't able to do the tricks that I would be able to do normally because I would had a little bit less of a window to accomplish them on PC than I did on Dreamcast. This is apparent when you're driving in certain sections of the map, and on Dreamcast it really slows down because it's rendering a lot of moving things that the Dreamcast doesn't like to do. So you would have a larger window to get the trick done, whether it be by 2 or 3 frames, than you would have done on PC when it's running better by all accounts. As a child, we equate driving to freedom. This is mainly thanks to TV and movies, thanks in part to it being the first landmark that you are officially an adult. Nowadays, though, a lot of people probably have their first driving experience in a video game. And on top of the fact that game developers are striving to have a realistic driving experience, that a lot of driving games are just pure driving simulations. Now, that shouldn't undercut the feeling of finally getting your license and having some semblance of a life outside of your home life and being unburdened from your family, from, you know, your general home life, however your experience may be. I mean, that's what driving really is, being unshackled from the ties to your family to an extent, and you being able to start living a life that isn't connected to your parents, having some sense of control over what you're doing. I mean, when my first homie got his license in our group of friends, it was amazing. We would hang out after school far more because he would drop us off, and on the weekends as well because he'd be willing to pick us up because he was more than happy to drive us. I remember when I got my license, I would drive like an absolute lunatic, and my friends also drove that way as well. Though we didn't drift, I had some friends do donuts in the abandoned parking lots of like the Los Angeles Zoo. I never did that because my car was more of a shared car with my sister, so she wouldn't be too happy if I wrecked it doing that. Things we had done outside of that is what my friend and I would call action movie training, which would be essentially driving in reverse in my very hilly neighborhood. Like I lived on a hill, and once you would before getting to my house, you would have to go down a hill and up a hill, and then around the corner, and then park on a hill. And my friend would be like, "Oh, can I reverse down this hill and could reverse to your house?" And I'd be like, "Yeah, sure, whatever." And we did that a lot of the time. One of my friend's dads once saw us do that, and he goes, "Do you know those kids?" And my friend said no, because it was embarrassing, because it was a dangerous thing to do. I would also do something called cartoon driving, which is essentially driving like they do in movies and TV shows and cartoons, which is over-exaggerating your wheel movement because you have to show that you're driving, because if you do that in real life, you're swerving your car like a drunk. And I did that for fun. And once I finished my AP art class and we went to Shakey's Pizza because we had a half day, I drove like that on the way back and freaked my friends out. There's also other action movie training, though that was more jumping out of a moving car onto a mattress we placed on the sidewalk. We did that for fun. I also sped. I sped a lot. I love speeding. It's one of the most euphoric feelings. I don't do it much anymore because I'm more panicky when I drive now. I don't drive like that now because I'm incredibly paranoid. I'd worry constantly about me dying while driving. Also, I'm incredibly prone to motion sickness. And I know they say that if you're driving the car, you're immune to motion sickness. And I can't tell you how frustrating it is to be the exception to that rule. So unfortunately, that feeling of freedom that is associated with driving whittles away as you get older. It's replaced by that constant feeling that you could die at any second by your own mistake or by someone else's mistake despite you doing everything right. It's truly terrifying. I miss being able to drive as if I were a dumb teenager and believed to be invincible and God's gift. Now I'm a paranoid mess and often I choose not to drive. That's why Crazy Taxi is the perfect driving game. With its madcappy physics engine and how you want to drive as fast as possible, it checks all the boxes of how it felt to drive when I first got my license. It's pure madness and euphoria for me while playing. In Crazy Taxi, I strive to drive as fast as possible in that game. While in other games, I find myself being constricted or, conservative in my speed, and it starts to feel a little bit rigid. I'm confined to not hitting things with fear of a possible rating going down or a loss of speed or me losing a race. You have to drive cleanly and perfectly in order to play well. And this is the case for every single non-GTA game. That doesn't count like Halo, but I don't really play Halo anymore. I guess really what it is that I'm a pretty above average role player when I'm trying to role play as the character of the person driving the car. The only true difference being is that I drift in these games, and I don't drift in real life because why would I ever do that? There are so many other factors to take into account while drifting, like signal lights, other cars, human lives. I would only really feasibly drift in a controlled environment. And I guess really video games are that controlled environment. So in video games, you drive how you'd want to drive. Whereas in Crazy Taxi, it sort of forces you to drive a little crazy. Hitting people is of no consequence in Crazy Taxi. You clip right through them, and even they might animate out of the way, you can still hit them and nothing happens to them. They don't ragdoll. You don't feel like, oh, I just ended somebody's life. Also, I have no worry about slamming into a wall or a building because the building's not being harmed. My car isn't being damaged in any meaningful way. And you kind of oftentimes might just bounce off the wall and back onto the street perfectly fine. The same can be said for cars, though. You see the cars flip over, but you don't even see anyone actually driving the car. You're the only person you physically see driving a car in Crazy Taxi. You feel like you're invincible in Crazy Taxi. And even if I bump into literally every wall or car possible, the physics of the game just might make you bounce off of everything like you're a goddamn Super Ball, because the car wants to go forward. It always wants to be moving. I am, in fact, invincible in Crazy Taxi, and I will never die. I mean, the way I drive in Crazy Taxi isn't that dissimilar to how I would drive in my formative years, where I thought I was invincible and would never die. I reverse a lot in Crazy Taxi because it is more useful than turning in place, because it's very slow and it's hard to get out of the drift turn while in place. Also, you can kind of realistically get a crazy dash out of a reverse easier than from a standstill, which is why it was more useful to me. I cartoon drive a lot in Crazy Taxi because I want to make a lot of tiny adjustments so I can get a lot of near misses while I'm driving to the next destination. This is counter to how Crazy Taxi wants to drive because the car always wants to go at a fixed straight line. So by me moving around, it's fighting against how the car wants to go. And obviously, I'm driving as fast as possible because I want to go as fast as possible to get them to their location as fast as possible, lest I be called a fool and stupid. To be an effective Crazy Taxi-er, I effectively had to relearn how to drive in a video game when we live in a world where games drive the same almost universally across the board, save for like Mario Kart or something. And that even plays way differently than Crazy Taxi. I'm terrified of playing another driving game and trying to do something in Crazy Taxi in that game. I'm terrified of driving in real life and throwing my Prindle into reverse at a moment's notice because in my dog brain, it's like, you want to go a little bit faster, bud? And I'm like, yeah. And I'll reverse and drive and get a little fender bender. Crazy Taxi is the most freeing driving game I've ever had the joy of playing. It's the most freeing driving experience I've ever had. It's like I put a lot of time into crafting this game. I'm really glad I chose Crazy Taxi. I mean, take a good look at Crazy Taxi. Look at all the charm and character they managed to squeeze into an arcade game. The map oozes with so much charm with its branded stores. Sure, even if it's capitalism at its finest, because let's face it, it's an advertisement for those stores, it still feels real. With how the map naturally has built-in shortcuts, whether it be an upturned bridge, you driving onto roofs to cut through streets, or using train tunnels to cut between parts of the map more effectively than it would be to drive around it. And listen to these customers. Listen to how they call you an idiot, call you stupid, call you a fool because you are bad at driving like a lunatic. But when you're cooking, and I mean really cooking, they're blasting you with compliments. And when you get them to their location as fast as possible, they get out of the car and they gas you up to keep you rocking and rolling. And the cabbies, sure, it's only 4 playable characters, but each one is so visually different and their car is so visually different. It matches their persona, their attire is so unique. And there's no difference between choosing any one of them. No single cabbie's better than the other. There's no stats assigned to them. So it really is going with your aesthetic that you'd want to play as. Obviously, this is all moot because BD Joe is the best one to pick from, so I don't know why you're picking anybody else. Sega really knew what they were doing when they were making games, and it's honestly a shame to see where they are now. So many of the games they were making in this era all had unique charm befitting of each of their own different games. And it's a shame big companies don't make games like this anymore. A lot of them feel very cookie cutter and samey. And honestly, charm like that can only really be found in indie games nowadays, though that might be a topic for another time. Hello from the future. Technically, it's still the past for you, but it's the future at which you are watching me, the filming of me, or at which point that I had filmed myself. As you can tell, my hair's a lot shorter, so that's how you know that's different. Recently, Sega had internal discussions about rebooting, remastering, or, just redoing the games that are so old that we all know and love. Crazy Taxi being one of them. So, finding interesting that they're all of a sudden realizing, hey, we had some good games, didn't we? Why don't we go ruin those? So can't wait to see how Crazy Taxi's ruined. From top to bottom, Crazy Taxi had so much care and effort and thought put into building this game to create such a wild world of driving. And this even extends into the music of Crazy Taxi. Offspring and Bad Religion populate the game's original soundtrack. And boy, do I wish I could have been able to hear that in an arcade. I wasn't expecting to talk about arcades again, but here we are, and honestly, the reason why I probably would have never have known that Offspring and Bad Religion was the game's music, because, let's face it, arcades are just a noise pollution factory, each game trying to overly stimulate you to play it. It's a shame I could have never appreciated Crazy Taxi's punk soundtrack in an arcade, and when I got my Dreamcast and was able to actually play it on April 21st, 2021, and I popped on Crazy Taxi and I heard that guy say, hey, it's time to make some crazy money, and the yeah from Offspring's All I Want fucking ruled. This is even not counting the fact that when you play it on PC and you pop on your first run and that guy says, hey, we're about to make some crazy money, and you get some generic store brand punk music that's just there. The music just oozed pizza parlor and fried chicken shack energy. It didn't hit as hard as Offspring did. That's why playing on the Dreamcast was still better, even if I beat my time and score on PC. I got that name brand recognition, baby. That KFC, that pizza parlor, that Offspring, that Bad Religion. It just fit. It made sense to me. Capitalism felt right for once. I'll never say that sentence ever again. Don't get me wrong. On PC, the music isn't terrible. It just seems off. It doesn't fit. It feels stiff when you're playing Crazy Taxi. A very thoughtful person had built a sound pack for Crazy Taxi to add in the original sound pack from the Dreamcast that you could mod into your PC version of your game. And I opted not to do this to get a very natural feeling or original feeling of the games. And boy, am I glad I didn't. Getting slapped in my face with the original music felt so right and felt so good. And I implore you, if you want to play Crazy Taxi, you have to play it in its original way. If you don't have a Dreamcast, a PlayStation 2, a GameCube, and you don't want to emulate it on your PC and you just want to buy it on Steam, then yes, use the sound pack because it's going to make your experience playing Crazy Taxi so much better. And it's going to feel so much more authentic, even though it's branded in such a specific way. I thoroughly enjoyed playing Crazy Taxi, especially learning how to actually play the game rather than playing it like it was a regular driving game. I mean, let's face it, Crazy Taxi doesn't operate like how other driving games do. I got to free myself of the driving restrictions you might place yourself in real life and in regular traditional games with driving mechanics. But let me tell you, Crazy Taxi is incredibly stressful. And that's when I laid my head down onto my bed as I laid in bed, having thought I finished a script, I had a perverse thought cross through my mind, realizing my work wasn't done. You see, I had thought that Crazy Taxi was the perfect driving game, and I was far from the truth. Crazy Taxi is actually the perfect time management game. With the timers going in Crazy Taxi, you're thinking so much more instead of just driving. You have so many questions and thoughts going through your head while playing. What's the best way to get this person to their destination? Who am I going to pick up next? Are they on the right cycle for me to pick them up? How much time do I have left? And do I just want to get the fattest time person that I can possibly get? I loved it. I loved everything about thinking like that while playing what I thought was just a driving game. Scanning the map while I'm driving and thinking about what makes sense for me at that exact moment was amazingly stressful. It was a good feeling of being stressed, of trying to think while you're playing this mindless driving experience. This is counter to how I was playing the game when I first played, which is being really bad at driving, not really knowing what I should or should not be doing, drifting a lot, picking up the wrong customers, people who had shorter distances and thereby not giving me enough time for other customers. But once I stopped wanting to drift and thinking I needed to drift and driving better and knowing what made the most sense for who I needed to pick up, the driving element of the stress went away and I could just drive without thinking about what I needed to do while driving. Instead, I got to think about where I would need to go that would be effectively make up the most amount of time saving that I needed to get more customers and more money. Subconsciously, I was thinking so much more about everything else but the driving in Crazy Taxi that's when the game truly started to make sense for me. Sega has managed to create something that on its surface is just a mindless and senseless driving game that is just makes you think it's just brain dead going back and forth for the passengers for where they want to go. And in reality, they made something that is so deep and intuitive that you really have to think carefully about what you want to do because you don't want to make the wrong decision and lose time. The nonstop thinking might be stressful, but you are truly pushing yourself to think in smarter ways for what the game wants. You're almost thinking like an actual cabbie, which is you know where you need to go and you just have to go which makes the most sense because you want to pick up another person after that. It's funny because I remember watching a video so long ago and it was about like the brain power of cabbies and why like there's a certain part of their brain that's slightly larger than other persons. It's something that can be grown over time and it's the long-term memory portion of their brain, I think. And it gets bigger because they have to remember a map because this was before, smartphones or, GPSs that would help them know where they needed to go. And while it was short term and I probably didn't grow that much, I understand that now than I did 4 weeks ago. What's so beautiful about Crazy Taxi is that you realize that you don't have a whole lot of time left and you're just trying to use that time effectively and what makes the most sense for you until eventually you have to hang up your keys.